Thank you very much. Thank you for that excellent introduction there from Triodos Bank. You're here tonight for the Schumacher event, where we will be discussing the topic of water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. The famous line, of course, from Samuel Taylor Coleridge in The Ancient Mariner. And we'll be discussing a wide variety of water issues, why it seems that that water just tips down on us out of the sky, and yet there isn't a great deal that we can do with it in some cases, because we seem to suffer recurrent drought in this country, and in other countries, of course, we have severe water crises that are becoming ever more frequent. I'll introduce myself first of all. I'm Fiona Harvey. I'm the environment correspondent for The Guardian, and I've been writing about these subjects for over a decade now. And the same recurrent problems seem to be always there when we look at water supply. Some places have too much, some places have too little. We in the West are using too much. People in some developing countries are exporting their water to us in the forms of goods such as food or clothing or manufactured goods. They're effectively exporting their water supply and we're buying it. And no one really seems to have very many answers, or at least people have ideas about answers, but very few of them seem to ever be implemented. So I'm going to be posing some questions around those issues to our panelists tonight. We've got a very distinguished lineup for you. I'll introduce them individually when it comes their turn to speak, but just very briefly, we have Tony Juniper, advisor to the Prince of Wales and former chair of Friends of the Earth. We have Andy Wheels, who's here from SAB Miller, and we have Aimee Sayer, who's here from Wessex Water. We're also going to have a short video presentation in a moment from Amory Lovins. We're going to try and finish this at 7:30. I'm just going to got a big clock up here. I have to say, this is the finest chair I've ever sat in. I wasn't quite sure I was supposed to at first because it seemed far too grand for the likes of me, but it seems very august. I hope it lends my chairing an authority it wouldn't otherwise have. We're going to try and finish by 7:30, and we're going to have brief speeches from each of our contributors, but then we will have a chance for all of you to have your say, to ask questions or to make points, and we've got roving microphones for you to do that, so that will come towards the end of the session. I hope that's all clear. If not, it should become so over what we're doing. And just one more point I'd like to make before we carry on. We're here tonight. This is an event that's been carried on since 1978, the Schumacher lecture or debate, and it's in honour of a lifelong environmentalist who had has had a profound influence on the green movement, and indeed is one of the founders of that movement in modern times. So that is just to give you a little bit of context of why we're actually here. We're carrying on a proud tradition that goes back several decades now, so it's very nice that we're doing that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Amory Lovins, who, as I say, is joining us by video. And Aimee, of course, a former advisor to President Clinton and founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute in America, which is one of the foremost, I don't know if you'd call it a think tank or a design lab. It's all of those things in the US, which is coming up with a range of ideas, and not just ideas, but also prototypes in many cases of wonderful new green technologies that we're hoping will save this blue and green planet. Thank you very much. Let's have Amory.
Good day. I'm Amory Lovins. I'm a scientist of Rocky Mountain Institute. That's an independent, entrepreneurial, not-for-profit think or do tank. Our vision is of a world thriving, verdant, and secure for all forever. And the best way we know to do that, therefore our mission, is to drive the efficient and restorative use of resources. I'm doing a little of that, I suppose, by not being with you personally as I should love to be, but rather sending you some electrons and leaving the heavy nuclei here in Colorado. But this does enable you to see integrative design in action. I'm talking to you from an unusual building, my house, for which I did the conceptual energy design in 1982. And this house is in a rather cold place. It's 2,200 meters up in the Rocky Mountains near Aspen, Colorado, where before global warming it used to go down to minus 44 Celsius on occasion. Now it only goes to minus 30 odd. But you can get frost here any day of the year. You can get 39 days of continuous midwinter cloud. And so it's not a reliably sunny climate. And yet, as you see, we are ripening banana crop number 37 at the moment, plus 4 more around the corner, with no heating system. And it was cheaper to build without a heating system because we saved more capital cost not putting it in than we paid extra for the super windows, super insulation, and so on that let us get rid of it. This illustrates what we call integrative design, where you design a whole building or industrial process or vehicle for multiple benefits rather than isolated bits for single benefits. For example, the arch that holds up the middle of this building has 12 functions, but I only pay for it once. This is the sort of design that we used in the Empire State Building a couple of years ago to save over 2/5 of its energy on retrofit with just a 3-year payback. And we have widely applied the same principle in everything else that uses energy, in over $30 billion worth of industrial processes and equipment and lots of vehicles. In fact, I brought along as a little sample an advanced composite part. This carbon fiber piece was made in 1 minute with 7-year-old technology, and it's extraordinarily tough, tougher than titanium, very light, very strong, and how very stiff and strong it is. So you can make autos out of this that are safer than today's, but 3 times lighter and cost the same to make. And that then enables you to afford to electrify them, because when you take out so much weight and drag, you need very few batteries or fuel cells to run the auto. So you can harness 3 very powerful synergistic learning curves, steeply falling costs in the ultralight materials, ways of making them into structures, and electric propulsion, and you end up with highly competitive electrified carbon fiber cars, the first 3 models of which will enter volume production from Audi, Volkswagen, and BMW by 2013. Very pleased to see that happening, and it creates a stunning competitive advantage for manufacturers that get into that early, something, by the way, Britain could still do quite well. Now, when you put together the scope for integrative design and new methods of delivering it in all the things that use energy, you get a remarkable result that we've synthesized for the United States in a new business book called Reinventing Fire, Bold Business Solutions for the New Energy Era. This describes in considerable detail how to run a 2050 U.S. economy that is 2.6 times bigger than today's, with no oil, no coal, no nuclear energy, 1/3 less natural gas, and a $5 trillion lower net present valued cost than business as usual, assuming that all external or hidden costs are worth 0, a conservatively low estimate. And the transition, we found, requires no new inventions and no act of Congress, but is led by business for profit. My hope for the future is that when we examine futures of that sort, we will focus on outcomes, not motives. That is, it doesn't matter whether you care most about profits and jobs and competitive advantage, or about national security, or about environmental stewardship and climate protection and public health, because we ought to do the same things anyway, without having to agree on whether you like all of those outcomes or which of them you think is most important. So if we just get on with doing the things that we agree ought to be done for whatever reason, then the things we don't agree about will become superfluous. And I think if you examine the combination of innovations in technology, design, public policy, and business strategy, as we've done in Reinventing Fire. For the UK, you will get strikingly similar answers that will help you in your work of pursuing practical transformation in a spirit of applied hope. Thank you, and have a wonderful conference.
Thank you very much to Aimee for that. That was an excellent introduction and a very inspiring one from a man who has done a huge amount to revolutionise the way we think about sustainability. And if you'd like to see more of that, more of what Amory and the Rocky Mountain Institute do, please do visit their website. It's very, well, you can spend hours on there, frankly, saying the amazing things that they're up to. And next up, we've got someone else who's been up to amazing things for a very long time, and it's Tony Juniper, who, as I told you, is an advisor to the Prince of Wales. He was chair of Friends of the Earth, and he's been a very influential and very respected environmentalist for a long time, one who's had a lot of input and impact on various other government leaders, businesses, and people like you and me over the years that he's been doing this. So, Tony, with your introduction, please.
Shall I go around to you, Fiona?
Yeah, can you?
More human scale down here. I'm used to sitting next to people in thrones, so Fiona certainly commands my respect by doing that, and my respect anyway for the great work she's done over many years. Thank you, Fiona, for that very kind introduction. So we're going from Amory's thinking about reinventing fire straight on to water. And this evening, well, I'm pleased to be here, first of all. It's great to be back in Bristol. I was a student here and lived here for some years, and I'm always very pleased to be back in this part of the country, but always too briefly. But very pleased you've all been able to come this evening to join in this discussion around water and what we're going to do about it. And it's one of those things, isn't it? You kind of notice as you follow the environmental debates as we go along, how there are various themes that come into focus and then we move on. And we've had rainforests, we've had ozone depletion, we've had agriculture. And the new one, I think, that's coming into focus now as we go forward is the whole question of water and what we are going to do about the mismatch between rising demands on fresh water globally and the ability of the natural environment to supply those demands as we increase the global output of food, as we look to the effects of economic growth in many countries leading to more municipal demand for water, and of course the expansion of industry and energy. All of these things are reliant on water. And one of the things that we know already, never mind what we know about the future, is that we might find some squeeze, certainly in some regions, between our desires to extract and the ability of nature to provide. But surely anyone looking at recent news headlines would think, actually, this isn't really a problem, is it? Because one minute we're told we haven't got enough, and the next minute we see caravans being washed into the sea by a deluge of fresh water. Well, actually, there is quite a lot of water on the Earth, and if one were to gather it all together, you come up with a total quantity of something like 1.4 billion cubic kilometres. Most of this arrived quite a long time ago when the Earth was quite young on comets and has been endlessly recycled ever since. But if you put all that water together and look at the proportion which is available for human use, you realise that actually it's not so much after all. Because if you take that 1.4 billion cubic kilometres, if you put it into one ball and then juxtapose that against the globe of the Earth, you find that there's like a little blue marble that covers Eastern Europe is all of the water pulled together. And I sometimes show this slide in lectures to underline the fact that actually this is quite scarce. And if you look at that blob, it barely would moisten the surface of the rock that's next to it. But what's more surprising still is if you go into the proportions of that blob, which actually are available to us, would you believe that 97.5% of that blob is salt water? It's in the oceans. Of the remaining 2.5%, a full 2/3 of that, would you believe, is in the ice caps, most of it in Antarctica, some of it on Greenland, and from the point of view of sea levels and everything else, it would be rather good if it stayed there. We have a further third, more or less, in the ground, and a tiny sliver, which is in rivers and lakes and on the surface and in the atmosphere in the form of clouds. About 1/3 of 1% of that 2.5% is actually fresh water. And that's the bit that's cycling around, going from clouds to rain, to rivers, to lakes, back to vapor, sometimes passing through animals and plants, through you and I, as it rejoins the water cycle. And that, of course, is what sustains life on Earth. And without that water cycling endlessly around, there wouldn't be any life on this planet, not terrestrial life. The thing, though, about water which makes it rather hard to grapple with from a sustainable development point of view is the fact that not only is it finite in the sense of that 2.5% of the total cycling around in the fresh water cycle, but only a tiny bit of it actually being available to us. It's very local in its occurrence. We can't really predict rain, certainly not over any lengthy timescales, as this recent drought and flooding has demonstrated quite admirably. It's a very local thing, and it moves very quickly. It's unpredictable, it's transient, and it's endlessly replenished. And those characteristics make it quite challenging, I think, to be able to get a grip on what we might want to do about water. And the other speakers will say something about this in a second. So if you put the demand rising, the fact that we've got a finite resource, and the fact that it's local and transient and unpredictable, put all those things together, and that makes it quite challenging. There's a further factor, however, which makes this more challenging still, and that, of course, is the implications of climate change, which is one of these risk multipliers we need to put on top of the water issue if we're to understand the challenge at hand. Now, I read a piece of work the other day by a chap called Paul Durack. You might, those of you who use the internet, look for a paper published in Science in April 2012, which talks about the accelerating speed of the water cycle. So I just mentioned a second ago that process of evaporation, rain, runoff. This is speeding up. And the reason it's speeding up is because the Earth is getting warmer. Now, these researchers, they looked into the ocean salinity to understand the rate of evaporation coming off the oceans with a global data set from all over the world, and they found that the oceans are evaporating more quickly than the climate change models suggested they would do. So we've got a more volatile water cycle superimposed upon those unpredictable elements that are built in anyway, plus also the rising demand. So this actually makes for quite a challenging situation, and I don't think Sir John Beddington, the government chief scientist, was wrong when he talked about a perfect storm linked to rising demand for energy, for food, and for water. And water, of course, is at the core of all of this, because water is essential for both of the other two. For all of our generation of electricity, pretty much, whether we have a coal-fired power station making steam, a hydroelectric dam, or a nuclear power station, all of those things need lots of water, and of course there's no food without water. And so looking at the projections for the near future, he's talking about there being this challenging squeeze, which I think everybody who's looking at the data in a fair way would say is pretty much on the mark. And you don't actually need to look at models to understand the changing nature of this particular set of issues. Just look at the data presented by the insurance companies globally, who are picking up that volatility in the water cycle as more evaporation is leading to more extreme events, causing damage which they have to pay out for because they are covering those kinds of risks. So what are we going to do about this? Well, our default reaction, I think, if you look back over the centuries in terms of how we've managed to improve water security and the ways in which we've been able to deal with the effects of extreme events like floods, plus how we've been able to deal with wastewater issues, we've invested in concrete, we've invested in pipes and technical infrastructure. That's been absolutely great. It's lifted living standards across the globe. It's enabled us to provide people with fresh water in their houses, a miracle compared to what would have been possible a couple of centuries ago. So we should be very proud of that, I think, in terms of how we've used engineering to achieve these outcomes. But I'm left thinking, and having spent the last 2 years writing a book called What Has Nature Ever Done for Us, I've come to the conclusion that probably the thing we should be investing in to navigate this water challenge in the future is less about concrete and pipes and much more about looking after nature and natural systems and ecosystems to enable us to be able to sustain water cycles in terms of upholding supply, and also to be able to deal with the effects of no water in the form of droughts. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of things that I've seen during the course of researching this book, which comes next year. So one place I want to take you first of all is the capital of Colombia, Bogota, high in the Andes Mountains, pretty much the same altitude as Amory Lovins' place, but on the equator, so a bit warmer. And that city, like every other, relies on fresh water for it to keep on running. Above that city, in the very high Andes, there's a high mountain habitat called the Paramo. It's like a giant sponge, it's like a blanket bog, and up there, the clouds that are coming up from the Amazon are intercepted by the high mountains, and this natural sponge is holding billions of tons of water. Those billions of tons of water are being released slowly by rivers, and they're coming down the sides of the mountains and into the city's reservoirs. Now, part of the trouble up there is the sediments being picked up by the rivers because of the clearance of the forest to grow potatoes. Now, in fact, Andy might say something about this because his company, or a subsidiary, Bavaria Beer, is working with the conservationists in that part of the world to try and reforest the watershed in order to be able to protect the water being captured at the top, but also to stop the sediments going in as it comes down. And some of the numbers that are being presented in terms of how much cheaper it is to protect the water supply through forests and peat bogs and high altitude wetlands is quite striking compared to the costs of putting in more concrete and water treatment plants. And that project looks like it's got legs on it. It looks like it's going somewhere, a solid partnership of people working together to try and restore the ecosystems in order to maintain the water supply. And of course, if you do that, you get a massive carbon benefit in the form of a protected bog plus forests, and you get a massive biodiversity benefit in this being one of the global hotspots for endangered animals and plants. They can be conserved at the same time. I came across the example of the Uluguru Mountains in Tanzania. Now, Dar es Salaam is the commercial capital of Tanzania. Most of the country's GDP is located in that city. Like everywhere else, it relies on water to grow the economy. The water for that city comes from cloud forests some hundreds of miles away in the coastal mountains. These forests, these cloud forests, are full of endemic species. My friend, Professor Neil Burgess, spends a lot of his time down there, and every time I see him when he comes back for a visit to Cambridge, he tells me about a new chameleon, a new frog, and even a new monkey they discovered each time they go down there. But not only is this forest a massive repository for biological diversity, it's the water supply for the city, because it doesn't rain there, but the cloud forests are intercepting the Indian Ocean moist air as it comes across from the ocean into the land. It hits the forest, and the forest lichens, the mosses, and the leaf litter beneath the trees is absorbing the water from the clouds. And then during the very dry parts of the year, when there's not even much cloud, that water is being released and it's refueling the city. The cloud forest is being cleared, it's being cleared for fuel wood, it's being cleared to make way for agriculture. But again, there's a project on the ground there that hopefully is going to be able to make a connection between the economic benefits in the city and being able to pay to keep those forests intact, to keep the water supply flowing into that commercial hub. New York City, a place where there's been really quite major innovation in terms of public water supply in recent years. New York City found that it couldn't cope with the number of people demanding water. It needed new capacity. It needed clean water without sediments. What should we do? The city looked at the idea of spending $7 billion on building new water treatment facilities, new ways in which water could be stored in reservoirs. Fortunately, someone came with a much cheaper solution, which was to pay farmers in the Catskill and Delaware Hills to keep their forests intact, to be grazing instead of doing arable farming, and to use those land use changes to encourage people to do cross-country skiing, to go fishing, to go bird watching. And as a result of that, New York has a more secure water supply, which is much cheaper to deliver, with many fringe benefits of biological diversity, carbon, and public recreation. In the Amazon basin, even in Brazil, I say even Brazil, that country's been obviously wrestling with the challenges of development and environment, particularly in relation to the Amazon basin. I was there a couple of years ago meeting ministers and was struck by the change in the attitude there towards that vast area of forest in the middle of the country. And I burrowed into this a little bit in terms of why suddenly the Foreign Ministry and the Economics Ministry are very concerned about slowing down deforestation in that region. And I discovered the simple reason was water in two forms. First of all, the water that is fueling the country's economic growth from the soya bean and sugar exports from the south. And secondly, the water that is responsible for 80% of the country's electrical power, which is being provided by hydroelectric dams. You don't need to be a genius, although in politics it probably helps to spot the obvious. In that country, they did actually realise there was a connection between rainforests and rain, and they decided, because water was so crucial to the country's economy, that they better protect the rainforest. And if you see the effects of this in recent years, the deforestation rate has plummeted in Brazil, and I think one of the reasons was the political connection made between rainforest, rain and water. So you can see there is the possibility to do these things in a real sense. Closer to home, the flash floods that damaged parts of northern English towns like Sheffield in 2007 has sparked a whole range of new interest in restoring wetland peatlands, upland bogs in the Pennines as one way in which we might be able to moderate the flow of water off the hills. Because one of the things we've done, never mind nature speeding up the water cycle as a result of global warming, one of the things we've done, of course, is speed it up ourselves by removing trees, by making rivers straighter, taking out wetlands, and the result of that, especially in this more volatile climate we have now, of course, is more flooding. So even where we've had these retrograde steps in the past, they're now being fixed, and not only do we see the restoration of peatlands in the Pennines now following the floods of 2007, but also those floods that hit Cumbria in 2009, leading to rivers being put back into a natural shape and trees being planted in the Lake District as well. So we can see some benefits there. Finally, one example I came across during the course of researching this recent piece was a very interesting project in Kenya, where the loss of trees on hillsides and the mining of soils for intensive agriculture basically had led to a collapse in farm incomes. And one of the approaches to be able to turn this back round, to get people being able to earn money so they could educate their kids and pay for healthcare, was to try and restore agriculture. And you've got several routes, of course, to do that. You can put more chemicals and chuck GMOs and more nitrates at it. This project looked at restoring soil fertility as one way of being able to combat drought, at the same time as replanting the hillsides with trees in order to catch the water, to cause the infiltration, stop the erosion. And the effects of this have been really quite transformative. And one of the things I learned looking at this project, which I was quite amazed about, was the effect of soil organic matter as a hedge against drought. Now, if you increase the amount of carbon in soils in the form of rotting plant material, you can actually increase the water retention 20-fold, would you believe? This obviously is very good if you're growing in a marginal area where it may not rain for quite long periods, but also if you're interested in ameliorating the effects of flooding and stopping soil erosion, it's a really good idea to hold the water in the soil. If you do that in combination with restoring watersheds to recharge groundwater beneath the soils, you can have really quite major economic impacts which are very beneficial for the people doing the farming. And those kinds of examples lead me to think that actually there's an awful lot we could do, which is cost effective, which is cheap, which has multiple benefits, as Amory was saying, in terms of how we look at these issues. Let's not just deal with one problem at a time, let's try and deal with several at once. And I think for most of the things that I've seen during the course of my investigations on this subject lately, tell me that if we want to cut carbon and hold it in ecosystems, if we want to conserve biodiversity, if we wish to make societies resilient to the effects of droughts and floods and extreme conditions, which are coming now whether we like it or not, because it's too late to try and keep the system stable as it was before, then investing in natural ecosystems as the way to do this, I think, is one way that we can ride out both this squeeze that's coming between water supply and demand, and also the ways in which the system is becoming more volatile. So, farming differently and being clear about what farming activities are appropriate for what soils, looking at the conservation of forests and wetlands, and looking at ways in which land use change can recharge groundwater. All these things we know about, we just need to start getting on with it. And of course, on the other side, not only is this about securing supply, it's about making sure we can deal with the effects of the extremes the other way, i.e. the flooding. And of course, we have plenty of ways of doing that. Sustainable urban drainage, whereby we encourage water to go into the ground when it hits the city, rather than be charging off through sewers and storm drains. We can do that, and it's very good for wildlife in cities potentially too. We can provide floodways, and we can restore wetlands, and we can build landscapes and urban designs in ways that not only are doing all these things, but bringing nature into the centre of cities and enabling people to be able to engage with it as well. So my basic point, really, is that we have a problem, and that the solution is really very possibly one of the most positive things we could do, not only in terms of being resilient to what we have to face in terms of water stresses, but also in terms of cutting carbon, conserving biodiversity, and making much, much, much nicer places for people to live in. So I think working with nature, certainly we need the concrete and the engineering, but the forests and the wetlands are the way forward, I think. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Tony. We had some excellent examples there and a great deal of positive encouragement for the things that we can do to actually allow nature to solve some of these problems for us if we work with nature instead of against it, as we too often have in the past. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to invite our next speaker to talk to us now. It's Aimee Sayer. So if you'd like to take the podium. Aimee is the Water Resources Planning Manager at Wessex Water. And when I was preparing for this last week, I was thinking that Aimee had got a fantastic job at the minute because we've had these dreadful problems with drought, and the drought now seems to have alleviated, and indeed in Wessex Water's area, because of the nature of what Wessex Water does and the infrastructure here, it was a bit less severe, to say the least, than in many other areas of the country. But now what's happened since then is that, of course, we've seen these flash floods in many places, and we've seen horrendous scenes and reservoirs threatening to burst, people having to be evacuated, and all sorts of things. It just seems that we've gone, directly from a terrible drought to severe flooding that's disrupting many families. So, Aimee, can you explain what's going on, and can you give us your solution? How are you going to fix it? Okay.
I think all bets are off. I think average is gone. I think average conditions are now behind us. Okay, so I'm going to kind of bring it back down from Tony's kind of big world view of issues around the planet to focus it in now on water supplies in our area and think about Wessex Water's water issues. The technology works, excellent. I work at Wessex Water, and the area that we supply is shown there in the pale blue area around the region. We've got 1.3 million supply customers. So actually stood here right now in Bristol Water's area, we don't supply the water to this facility. We do treat the sewerage in this area, and we've got 2.7 million waste customers, which are then highlighted in the periphery areas in the darker blue there. On average, we provide around 340 million litres of water to our customers every day. That means we abstract it from the environment, we treat it. We use one of our 110 different treatment works to make it clean and safe for you to drink. We then pump it through our 11,500 kilometres of water mains. But I'm going to talk now a little bit more about water resources planning and what that means for a water industry. And essentially, the aim of water resources planning for a water company is to make sure that we balance supply and demand for water and protect the environment while we do that. Every 5 years, we prepare what are known as water resources management plans, which do a look ahead for the next 25 years. And these are regulated plans. We have to go through regulation and review with them. And the next plan that we'll be publishing for public consultations, you'll all be very welcome to read it and comment on it, will be next April. As I mentioned, it is quite a regulated industry. We've got several key regulators, and one of these is Ofwat, which are there to make sure that we're offering good value and service for customers. So when we prepare our plans and what we want to do to make sure we manage that supply and demand into the future, we propose an investment strategy, and Ofwat review that, and they set the price limits by how much we can put bills up by to make sure that we can fund our investments. The Environment Agency, their key role is there to protect and improve the environment. And so we work closely with them to make sure that our abstractions from certain areas around the patch will not be damaging the environment. And if they are, then we need to investigate and redress that issue. DEFRA is obviously the government agency. Sounds quite serious, doesn't it? The government agency for developing policy. And so they will give the water industry a steer on what we should be doing and how they expect us to plan for the future to make sure that we're meeting that balance between supply and demand. There are many other agencies and stakeholders, and many of you may be from some of those organisations as well that we liaise with. For example, Natural England and the Consumer Council for Water are there to look after and make sure that we're representing our customers' interests too. So essentially, though, water resources planning is actually a really rather simple process. We've got to look at what the demands are for water on one side, we look at what available supplies we've got, and then we allow a margin around that. So we've got to factor in a bit of uncertainty for if our assumptions aren't quite correct. Then we simply ask and look, have we got enough water, both now and for the next 25 years into the future? If we do, then that's great. We don't necessarily need to propose to change our behaviours or change our actions or propose new investments in any way. We might still choose to bring more resilience into the system. We don't necessarily have to. If we don't, if during that planning period, the next 25 years, we do identify that there are actually periods where the demands for water may exceed what we've got available, then we need to think about what are the options that are available to us, what could we do to redress this balance, and then what is the best thing that we could do. That all feeds into this water resources management plan, which goes through consultation, which then goes into our company business plan, which determines what investments we make, particularly for the next 5 years, but then further into the future too. I said it's very simple, but obviously the devil is in the detail. And in each of those different elements of this calculation, then there are lots of things that we need to consider in quite a bit of detail. So on demands, we obviously need to be thinking about population growth in the area. We need to be thinking about house building and how then different changes in the average occupancy, the average household side, how that might affect how much water is used and what demands may be. We need to be thinking about water efficiency measures and how people's behaviours may change, which may increase or perhaps reduce demands for water into the future. We've obviously got to consider leakage and whether we're going to drive it down further, by how much, by when, and climate change. With climate change, perhaps with warmer summers, then how is that going to affect people's behaviours? Will people shower more? Will they have to wash their clothes more? What's going to happen? We need to be thinking about all of these things. On supply, we need to be calculating what available supplies have we got today. You know, were our assessments we did last time round, are they still accurate? The recent drought we've had, do we need to reassess what waters are actually available right now? We need to think about licence reductions as well. I mentioned earlier that the Environment Agency, we work closely with them to make sure that where we abstract water, that it is a sustainable abstraction. There are cases where there is cause for concern, where perhaps our impact on the environment when we take water is perhaps it's not sustainable and it may have an unacceptable impact on the environment. The way that we redress this is that we reduce our abstraction licences in those areas, and so we need to be making sure that we factor that into our planning to make sure that we're making sure we've got enough water to meet that deficit should we need to reduce licences to protect the environment. On margins as well, we need to think about source outages, because obviously not all of those 110 treatment works are going to be available at full capacity at all times. There will be occasions when we might have a pump failure or something, there could be a more serious outage, and we need to make sure that we're kind of allowing a margin for things not always working perfectly. If we have got to assess how we're going to meet any deficits and look at options, we go through detailed optioneering process where we're looking at costs of options that could meet the solution, that could provide the solution. And when I say costs, we're not just looking at financial costs. We also build in social costs and environmental costs. So what would be the kind of the holistic impact of these different things, and how does that compare with our current activities? And so what is the best solution for the problem? Other influences, of course, for the water industry come from government. I mentioned before about DEFRA's policies. In the recent water white paper that was published, we got a clear steer: leakage must not be allowed to rise. So we need to be factoring that into our plans, and demand must come down. We've been given clear guidance that we must try and help each of our customers reduce their water use. We also have these 1.3 million customers, and we need to meet their expectations. They pay the bill, they pay our salaries. We need to make sure that their expectations are met. The feedback that we get, we run lots of workshop sessions with them. We run lots of research to find out, to make sure that we are understanding what people want. They want to have more power over their bill. They want to be able to reduce it and manage their finances more effectively. They also want to save water. They want us to make it easy for them to do so. They want more choice. They want to trust us more as well. Often the utilities are seen as the kind of the bad guys, and so we need to look at ways that we can build that trust and improve communication with them. So bringing all of these issues in together, then kind of I believe, and Wessex Water believes, that resilient solutions to meet many of these challenges will come from demand management issues in the future. So we want to be looking more at reducing leakage, about increasing metering, which will help drive demand down, and about water efficiency, which goes hand in hand with metering to help empower people to make the right choices and reduce their demand. So what I'd like to do now is just go through each of these three issues and give you a few kind of a few of the concepts that we're working with at the moment. So leakage, it kind of came to the fore in the mid-1990s, and government gave a really clear steer to the industry: leakage must be reduced. Since 1995, Wessex Water has halved leakage. So, and we always meet our leakage target. The UK as a whole, leakage has come down by about a third, so we're doing quite well there. We're quite proud of our efforts. However, leakage has been reduced from 140 million litres per day down to around 70 million litres per day. And many of you will probably say that's still a lot of water, and so we must be encouraged to keep trying to drive it further down. We spend around £12 million every year on finding and fixing leaks, and fix around 12,000 leaks in our network. But we understand that it is a key priority for our customers. And so this year, with the increase in interest in many of these issues earlier with the dry weather that we had a few months ago, then we changed our policy, and we've been trialling this year fixing reported leaks next day or same day if we can. And so we're trialling that this year to see what difference that will make to our leakage management. We previously used to repair leaks probably 90% within 10 working days. So now there's quite a step change for us, and hopefully that's going to bring about some greater benefits. Going forward into the future in terms of leakage reduction, the key thing for us is going to be the increase in metering, which I'll go on to in a moment, whereby with more meters on the network, people will spot leaks themselves. We'll get more customer reported leaks because they can see their water usage, and they will report them to us so we can get out there and fix them. And also we'll be able to spot them ourselves from our own offices where we're monitoring the network. More monitoring, more data will allow us to find those leaks quicker. So moving on to metering, UK as a whole, metering is about 35%. So 35% of households have a meter. They pay for the volume that they actually use. In Wessex Water area, it's slightly higher, around about 50%. Most of our customers do agree that it really is the fairest way to pay for your utilities, like you pay for your gas and your electricity in this way. And it gives you that price signal to think about how much you're using. We recently conducted a trial that lasted 3 or 4 years looking at change of occupier metering. So when customers phoned us up and said, I've just moved into a different house, we then took them, in setting up their account, we then went out and installed a meter, and we monitored then their use, and we could see then the difference. We were working with around 6,000 households. We had a control group as well of people that had moved house, but we didn't install a meter, so we had something to compare it to. And basically we found that people who moved into a house and the meter installed, water use reduced by around 15%. This is much higher than previous estimates had thought. Studies that were done back in the 1990s thought it would only be sort of 10 or 12%, so 15% reduction on average is quite significant. This is linked back into, we believe, moments of change. So when people move house, their behaviours are all up for grabs kind of thing. Everything is changing. It's possible to influence their behaviours with the right information. Similar findings have been found in recycling studies where you can, because we all know our behaviours get really embedded when you've lived somewhere for a while and this is the way we do things. When you move house, you give people the right information. And they're also choosing new white goods, and they might then try and choose things that are a bit more efficient and use less water. And so we believe that this is the way forward, and we'll be proposing a policy of installing meters when people move houses into the future in our next water resources management plan and business plan. We also think that the future lies with smart technology. We're running a trial starting later this year with around 1,000 houses down in around the Dorchester area, where we'll be giving them, we'll be providing applications that they can use on their smartphones so they can monitor their water use. They can then compare themselves to other people in the area. They can get rewards for their community for reducing their water use. We want to try this. Not everybody's got a smartphone, so we're going to provide the same service by text message and by email, whatever works. We want to try and engage with our customers and see how we can help them to be empowered to drive their water use down. So moving on to water efficiency, to think about how we can reduce water use, we need to go back to the starting position and think how much water do we all actually use. Well, the average Wessex Water customer uses 140 litres of water every single day. It may surprise many of you to hear that, especially if you're a Wessex customer, you might be thinking, really, do I use that amount of water? Because I've never met anybody who thinks that they actually waste water. But my theories around this lie that much of this comes back to invisible water use. You may not realise, every time you put your washing machine on, it uses somewhere between 30 and 60 litres of water, but it's invisible to you. It happens within that white box in your kitchen. You don't even get your hands wet generally. You don't realise and appreciate. And so that's why we always harp on about only put the washing machine on with it when you've got a full load. Dishwashers is a similar kind of thing. You don't get your hands wet. You're not washing up by hand, perhaps. You don't realise how much water you're using. Dishwashers are actually quite water efficient, though. They tend to use between 10 and 20 litres of water, which, when you think about it, if you've had a nice big Sunday lunch with all your friends and families, you've got lots of pots and pans, it may be more efficient to put it in the dishwasher and get it clean that way than it would actually be to wash it by hand and change the bowl several times. 30% of the water, on average, that's used in our homes is just flushed down the toilet. That's a lot of water when you think about the fact that that is water that we've abstracted from the environment, we've treated it to drinking water standards, we've pumped it to the homes, and there's a carbon footprint associated with all of that process, and it gets to the toilet system and it's flushed and it starts again. So that's why we often say only flush if it's really necessary. And then there are links between hot water and energy. A 5-minute shower could use anything between 40 and 100 litres of water, depending on what type of shower you've got. If you've got a power shower, you could be using 100 litres in what you might think is a relatively quick shower. 5% of the UK's carbon emissions come from heating water in your homes, and so there's a real key driver there for us, that it's not just about saving the water, but it's saving the energy and all those things linked together. And what might be the key driver for some people is the fact that 25% of your energy bill may actually be linked back to heating water in your home. So with water efficiency, then I think we need to recognise, all of us, that there are different drivers for different people, and we need to embrace those. We need to just make it relevant for everyone. If customers are interested in the environmental savings of abstracting less water, then let's run with that. Let's give them the information. Let's give them the facts. If they're only motivated by their financial situation and controlling their bill, then let's provide them with the information for that. We also need to make it really, really easy. We need to give out free devices and information and just help people embark on the journey of reducing their water. Last year, Wessex Water provided around 35,000 free devices to customers. These were requested. We didn't just send them out willy-nilly. These were people that engaged with us and requested devices. So it could be a shower flow regulator that you fit to your shower and reduces your flow rate down from about 12 litres a minute down to about 7 or 8. So you're helping there reduce water and your energy use. And also the cistern displacement devices. You could put a brick in your toilet cistern, or you could get on our website and request and get a bag which is filled, and it will displace 1 litre of water for every time you flush. Also importantly, we need to make sure that we're educating the next generation. We employ 2 full-time education advisors which go out to schools and run classroom sessions with children, and last year they worked with 13,000 children in the Wessex Water area, and water efficiency was a core part of the classroom lessons. Government's also got a part to play with building regulations, and they can help drive building design and how to make sure that we're designing new homes that are water efficient from the outset. Of course, it all does come back to behaviour, but if we're putting the measures in place from the start, we're making it easier for people to make those choices. There's also the issue of product labelling. The Bathroom Manufacturers Association have recently launched, and you can see an image of it there on the slide, a water efficiency symbol, which looks very much like the energy efficiency one that we're all quite familiar with now. Whenever you're buying a white appliance, everybody wants to have the A++ thing to make sure they're saving as much energy as they can. Well, let's think about this in water as well when we're choosing appliances. I'm a bit worried that consumers might start getting confused with having too many different product labelling, and so it would be great if we could all work together and have some kind of combined sustainable product labelling system that just gives that indicator on that kind of level. So kind of to try and bring this together, really, I've hoped that I've kind of given you a whistle-stop tour of saying that there are lots of competing issues that are working sometimes together and sometimes against each other. So the things that are making it more difficult for us, that might be driving demand up or driving supply or uncertainty in the wrong direction, could be that we've got growing population, we've got growing property building in the area, there's climate change which is bringing a whole set of new uncertainties to us, and raw water quality issues and licence changes as well. But I believe that with these three kind of demand management measures of leakage reduction, metering and water efficiency all combined together, we can help improve the situation. So to bring it into the context, this is a chart here which shows the amount of water that we've been putting into the distribution network since 1981. The dark blue line is showing the annual average, and the paler blue line is showing those spikes that occur during the summer generally, when we might get increased demands. And so we can see that since 1995, as we've had increases in metering, which has been driving demand down, and we've had significant reductions in leakage, on average, demand has been falling. And kind of hot off the press, this is very much work in progress. I said we're publishing a new plan next year. The work that is coming together at the moment is showing that if we deliver these demand management measures, we can try and hold demand level. And so we can accommodate that population growth and property building in our area, but hold demands and the impact on the environment much more stable through these demand management measures. So then just to finish up really, is just to say, get involved, do your bit, you can all reduce your water use, I'm sure. If you go to our website, you can go and request a free pack and get information on as well on how you can reduce your water use. If you're a Bristol Water customer, they offer the same kind of service. So go to their website and you can get some information. Thank you very much.
We move on from there. I might do a quick show of hands as to whose water is metered here at the moment. Right. Okay. Okay. Seems to be clustered around here. I'm not quite sure why. But there we go. Okay, there we go. That was, I'd say a little bit under half, but there we go. That wasn't very scientific polling. Right, we're going to move on now to, from Wessex, we're going to Wales now, because we've got Andy Wales, who's here. He's the Senior Vice President for Sustainable Development at SAB Miller, which is, as you know, a brewing company and beverage company that has done a great deal to look at its own use of water, to make its use of water more sustainable, recognising that that in the future water supplies are likely to come under increasing stress, as we've heard from our other two speakers. But Andy, the key question I'd like you to answer when you take the podium here is really what has the brewing industry ever done for us? I hope we'll hear something about that.
The brewing industry has done a huge amount of good, including being the basic beverage about 400 years ago, before we had so much great water treatment. I wanted to start off by saying that sadly I think water is a little bit geeky. And I don't mean that to offend you. In fact, I've been a water geek for more than 10 years. Unfortunately, it's not as lucrative as being a tech geek, being a water geek. But it's a really big challenge, because the issue of water has been discussed for so long amongst environmentalists and development professionals, both in terms of the environmental scarcity issues and quality issues around water, and in terms of the development impact, the human development impact of increased access to water and sanitation. And we need to move beyond the geekiness of that to make it much more economic, to bring a lot more of the hard numbers into understanding why it is that a finance minister or a planning minister or an agriculture minister or an energy minister in the 70 countries around the world that we operate in needs to understand water as well as they do some of the financial numbers of their economy. And so what I wanted to talk about and show you some slides about was to talk through why the economics of water is becoming much more critical, why it's becoming critical for multinational companies like SAB Miller, why it's becoming critical for many countries around the world, and how it is that we need to take that conversation forward. Let me start by explaining a bit more about SAB Miller. We are a global brewer, grew from African origins actually, now the second largest brewer in the world, brewing beer in about 70 countries, including Colombia, and also the largest brewer in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, and a business that sees sustainable development as part of the core design of our business in terms of how it is that we'll be able to grow in a growing world with a growing middle class where we're able to meet their needs. And if you look at some of the numbers around the growth of population, the growth of wealth, they're quite startling. So about now we have around 2 billion middle class people in the world, including you and me. By 2030 we expect to see more like 5 billion middle class people. Now often from an environmental perspective we talk about that in the context of woe and destruction because of the huge resource impact they will have. But we need to start off by recognizing that that is a really good thing. That a lot of people who are alive now and will be alive in a few years' time will have the same quality of life or approaching a similar quality of life to that you and I can have. Having a coffee in the morning, having a bit of meat a few times a week. If you eat meat, and probably if I asked you to raise hands, I'd have a chunk of people here who don't. But that whole growth of the middle class is actually a really good thing for development, but it does give us very large sustainability challenges. And so for a business like ourselves, we're 10th on the FTSE 100, so a bit bigger than, say, Tesco or Unilever. It's really critical that we understand how it is we meet the needs of those coming consumers and those growing wealthy consumers whilst dramatically changing the resource structure of our entire value chains to make sure we can do that within the resource constraints. Before I tell you the detail of water, let me just give you a bit more context about SAB Miller. So we manage sustainable development through these 10 sustainable development priorities. They cover, obviously, because we're an alcohol business, starting at the top, discouraging irresponsible drinking, through the 4 environmental priorities I hope you'd expect around water and climate change, around energy and carbon, and packaging and waste, and then through some of the more social issues, all the way through human rights, transparency to HIV/AIDS, which for us as a business that's large in Africa, Asia and Latin America is quite critical. And we didn't coordinate, Tony and I, but actually, if you go online, you can see the performance of our business in Colombia and all of our other businesses, Bavaria, that one's called, all those 10 issues, and you can dig into why it is that they score that level. It explains the scoring system, and you can click through to the case study that Tony talked about. But if you can't bother to do that, I'll give you a slide on it later as well. So sustainable development is core to the way we want to grow our business. And right at the heart of that is water, because water is obviously a very visible part of our product. And it's a very much discussed issue, not perhaps so much here in the UK debate, apart from when we have floods or droughts, but much discussed around the world. And there are a whole range of stats. Tony's given you some. There are some more on the slide there around where water is used in agriculture, the majority, some in industry, and then some domestically. But the big challenge is that water is quite a hot political issue. Water, you can talk about it as a resource, but you can also talk about it, as a human right. You can talk about it even as a spiritual thing in many cultures. And so water, things like pricing water and allocating water actually become political issues very quickly. And so stepping into this debate, we have to be, particularly on the economic side, quite careful about how we do that. But we absolutely have to do it because water underpins so much of where economic growth will go. And this is a really important concept that underlies a lot of what Tony spoke about and underlies a lot of our business planning at the moment. It's the water, food, and energy nexus. And it's the fact that actually you can't manage a resource like water separate from your policy on agriculture and food and separate from your policy on energy. Actually, they have to be brought together in quite a powerful way. And that's because growing our food takes a huge amount of energy and fertilizers and distribution and everything else. Also has quite a big impact on water through the pollution of water from agriculture. As we've heard from Aimee, actually producing the water that you need takes quite a lot of energy to treat it and to clean it and to pipe it. And so actually water itself has quite a big impact on emissions. And then of course energy, and many people aren't aware of this, energy is one of the biggest water users around, far bigger than the beverage industry or many other industries, in terms of the amount of water it takes to create the energy that you need. And of course as we move to more sustainable things like, for example, some of the discussions and debates and hot topics around biofuels, water becomes even more critical in that context. And what we need to do, and what's critical, is that instead of having government departments to focus on these separately, is actually see policy that begins to integrate these much more, just as we have to within business. And let me give you a local example of that. So this is South Africa. On the left-hand side, you can see it's a map of the 19 different water management regions in South Africa through which the government manages water resources. And the first thing you can see is that they're different colours because water is a very, very local issue. So the tensions, the challenge and the supply even though they have some national connectors, they have a lot of interaction with countries around them through transboundary water. Actually, the demand is very local and the debates are very local. But we're going to see quite a significant increase in demand for water in South Africa. And in fact, the global aggregate figure for 2030 is that we'll be about 40% water short. Demand will be about 40% higher than supply. In South Africa, it's going to be 17% higher. And that's particularly because of growing industrialization to meet consumer demands. But what's most interesting, and not that often heard in some of the environmental debates we have, is that South Africa can address that water gap and save at the economy level $150 million a year. Now, this is a cost curve from a delightful set of very reasonable management consultants called McKinsey, which looks at how it is we can take different steps in different parts of South Africa, in the agriculture, in business, in the government and the public policy side, to address that water gap, both through demand reduction and through improving supply and improving management of water, reducing leakage, reducing water use in agriculture. And the most important thing to understand about this is that everything below the horizontal line saves money. So South Africa can actually meet its water gap if we work in a water smart and coordinated way, with the public and private sectors working together, and at the economy level save money. And having these kind of charts and the depth of this analysis transforms the quality of conversation we have when we talk to the finance minister, the agriculture minister, the energy minister in different countries about the water challenge. Because it's no longer just an environmental issue or a development issue, important as those are, but it's also about the core of how they grow as an economy. And if you take that to the global level, McKinsey did some work they published last November, which was perhaps even more compelling, which was they looked at that water, food, energy nexus and the way that different resources interact. And of course, we're currently in a difficult economic time globally. And they concluded that by 2030, there was an opportunity of about $3 trillion globally, an opportunity to save money as a society, as the world, if we could manage those resources in a different way and become dramatically more efficient. And this kind of stuff is incredibly powerful in my boardroom, because this is what helps us understand the economy in which we as a business can be more profitable in the future, but the societies that we'll be part of will be growing and successful as well. And then last night there was another interesting piece of research launched at the Cutty Sark in Greenwich in London by HSBC, WaterAid and some others, which looked at the economic impact of actually getting water access to all. And what you can see here, hopefully it's fairly clear, is on the left-hand side you can see a graph that shows the economic gain as a result of either meeting the Millennium Development Goal on water access and sanitation, which is to reduce by 50% those that don't have access, or on the kind of light blue bar actually to get universal access to everyone. And the most compelling thing about that is that a number of those sub-Saharan African countries, you're looking at a gain of 5 to 10% of GDP if you can actually get those basic water connections in place. So it's a very positive story from an economic perspective. Of course, it costs money in terms of investment, but the paybacks are typically 2, 3, maximum 5 years. And so actually, there's some quite strong arguments there. So let me bring this to the micro level to a company, mine, that brews beer around the world, and say, what does it mean for a big company? So this is Castle Beer in South Africa. We published the first corporate water footprint in 2008, and we published others since. You can go online and see it. And what you'll see halfway down that chart on the right is the water footprint for a Castle Beer. The total water footprint is about 155 litres of water to make 1 litre of beer. Now, seems huge, right? About 4 of those are in the brewery. The vast majority of the rest is actually rain-fed water and is in agriculture. But before we think, leave that thinking that's a massive number, Aimee talked about the fact that as an average British consumer, and perhaps particularly in this region, your daily water consumption is about 140 litres of water per day to flush your loo and to run your washing machine and everything else. Your actual water consumption is more like 4,600 litres of water per day. And that WWF launched a great report about that in August 2008. It's on the website, on the internet. Because that's the embedded water in all the goods and services and products that you buy and consume each day. And in fact, I'm wearing cotton shirts and cotton socks, and I'll stop there. But I mean, an average British person's daily cotton water footprint is 220 litres of water per person per day for the clothes, just the cotton clothes that you're wearing. So the way that trade works, the way that water is embedded through agriculture and through industrial production into our goods and services actually has, the way we consume, has a huge impact on that. And the beer ranges roughly from around, in Czech Republic it's about 40 litres of water to make a litre of beer, all the way through to 180 in Tanzania, because of greater irrigation in Tanzania and agriculture. And actually beer, interestingly enough, is one of the most water efficient beverages. Tea is a bit better. Obviously water itself out of a tap is very, very efficient. And I would encourage drinking that. But then things like coffee, orange juice, wine, are hugely more water intensive than beer. So one of the key things is that companies begin to understand these numbers and grapple with them, and we've published for a number of years with WWF these numbers to try and stimulate that debate. And what that's led to in our business is quite a comprehensive strategy around how we manage water within our own fence line and up and down the value chain. So we call this the 5 R's of water responsibility, although you notice that actually one of the R's is really a P, and mine called protect. But in the middle, in the brewery, around reduce, reuse and recycle, typically takes about 4 litres of water to make a litre of beer. We've reduced that 5% in the last year, and our goal is to knock that down 25% between 2008 and 2015. And that's important to do, and it will save us money. But actually, the really important stuff is upstream in terms of the watersheds, understanding the shared water risk that we face with communities and with ecology. And that's where we've been putting a lot of effort to kind of dimension that risk, understand what it means for us as we grow as a business going forwards, and then build partnerships to seek to protect those scarce water resources. And so we have this partnership, interesting enough, co-funded by the German government, for which we're very grateful, through their development agency GIZ, and with WWF, and the German government co-funded it with us because they wanted to see how businesses could, not through their philanthropy, but through their operational budgets, look at how water resources could be protected in a way that helps the business grow and also helps communities and ecology. And so I wanted to finish on 2 examples. The first is the one that, the first one's in India, sorry. The first is in India, in Rajasthan, where we have a brewery in a place called Ruchis, which is an arid area. Those of you who've visited Rajasthan, much of it's desert. It's interesting, the whole beer industry in India, because we brew within Rajasthan because the state government requires us to, and we buy from lots of smallholder farmers around Rajasthan as part of our value chain work around sourcing and enterprise development. But it's a very water-challenged area. And so we not only do we have to become more efficient ourselves, but there's a whole range of things we need to do in the value chain and with communities to deal with water risk. And so one of the things we've been doing with a range of NGOs and the Confederation of Indian Industry is to build some check dams which recharge monsoon water into the aquifer. So far we recharge more each year than we use as a brewery in that area, so that's good. You could technically call us water neutral, although I think I'm not really a fan of that term. But the thing is that actually doesn't remove the risk, because farmers across Rajasthan are continually depleting the aquifer. And so the most important thing to do there is actually work in quite a widespread way with farmers to get them to change the way they do their agriculture. And so that's what we've been doing as part of our risk management strategy there. The other one is Colombia, the example Tony referred to, where actually we started, the reason we got involved in this is we started to see our water prices going up dramatically in our brewery in Bogota. And we went to the municipality and asked them why. And it turned out it was because of the deforestation in the Paramo, which was leading to increased sedimentation in the rivers and therefore an increased cost to take that out of the water to supply us and the rest of Bogota. And so we worked with the Nature Conservancy and a range of other partners to fund this payments for ecosystem services, which gets farmers to manage their land differently, to reforest, to put in hedgerows and so on. And economically, it's a no-brainer. It costs in total about $1.5 million a year. I think we put in 10% of that. And it saves the city of Bogota $3.5 million a year from year one, arrested our water price rise. And you think that's the kind of thing we should be doing everywhere, right? And we should, but it takes time, because it takes time to get businesses and NGOs and governments together and discussing that. And so I'm going to finish early because I thought I'm the last person. I wouldn't want me to be between you and a cold beer. And that's actually someone sitting above Bogota with an Aguila, looking over the city. But what I wanted to do is to finish on 3 things, really. The first thing is, what do we need from business? What we need from big business is for us to work in a coordinated way, not just a few leading businesses like us or Unilever or whoever else it is, but to get a whole large scale of businesses working together to set up large-scale watershed protection schemes under the leadership of government. And that's where lots of businesses have done well in recent years, setting up their projects with specific NGOs in particular geographies. But we need to bring it together. And so one of the things we funded through the UN CEO Water Mandate is essentially a water dating agency, which is about bringing together the different businesses that have different business risks in similar geographies and similar watersheds, so we can work together to scale this work. We also need businesses, obviously, to push that through their supply chains, and that's what we're doing, it's what Unilever and others are doing, and we need to scale it. But we also need quite a lot from governments, because if we continue to have policy on water, energy, planning overall, land use planning, and agriculture that's separate, then that creates a huge problem for those companies that are trying to work in that context, understanding the overall resource together. And obviously the Rio Plus 20 Summit starts next week. A lot of people going there this week to have all sorts of debates. And one of the key things there is to bring that government-business conversation together in a much more proactive and focused and action-oriented way. And the final thing I was going to discuss was what do we need for us as citizens and as consumers of people who use 4,600 litres of water a day. And for me, that's first and foremost about awareness. So there's all sorts of stuff on the web. Go to waterfootprint.org, and you can find out all the glory of how much water your steak or your vegan cutlet or whatever costs. And start to think through in your water use in your home, but also in the way you consume and which products you choose, how it is that you can understand your water footprint and then reduce it and be water smart. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Thank you for that very illuminating talk, with some fabulous examples there of what you're doing and how you're working with other parties and with government and so on. I think one of the most endlessly fascinating things to me is this issue you brought out of embedded water or virtual water. You know, I remember first writing about this some years ago and saying, how do you fit 100 litres of water into one cup? And the answer is fill it with coffee, because the amount of water that goes into growing the coffee beans and processing and so on is so huge that's the effect of what you're doing in terms of this embedded water or virtual water. And as a result, we end up, as a country that's water stressed in some places when we have droughts like at the moment, but overall is doing not too badly. We are actually importing water from areas that are actually very water stressed, for instance in the Middle East, in terms of virtual water. And something else that's very important when we look at industry and their relationships with water is, as you say, industries working together, because in a sense, if industries are viewing themselves always just as competitors in this field, we're not really going to get the kind of widespread water solutions that we need. Okay, now at this point, we've heard the view from the Rocky Mountains. We've heard from Tony the sort of holistic view of what we're doing with water and what we need to do and where we need to be. We've heard a local view focusing down on some very domestic issues like our own sort of water metering and water usage, and we've heard a view from business there, sort of global view from business there from Andy. So we've had a very wide-ranging discussion, and now it's going to get even wider, because I'm going to invite you to make your comments or to ask your questions. I would ask that you keep them sort of succinct, and the other thing I would say is that if anyone would like to use social or electronic media to carry on this discussion, of course there is always Twitter, and the hashtag is #BGW, which stands for Big Green Week, and the Twitter handle is @BigGreenWeek, all one word, and on Facebook it's Big Green Week as well. So just in case any of you want to do that during our discussion or afterwards. So if you have a point, I'm going to take several at a time, and we've got some roving mics, so if you could raise your hands, and I'll take a few at a time. There's a lady over here in the back row in green who I saw first, so I'm going to take you first, then the gentleman down here in the front, then by the door here, and then over here in the end. So if I take, can I take all of you at once? I think I can. If I take those four at once, and then we'll move on to the next. If you could tell us who you are, please, and ask a question or make your comment.
Hello, I'm Teresa. I'm studying environmental policy and management here in Bristol, and I'm from Germany. And in Germany, we have a debate at the moment about water saving, because basically Germany is very good in water saving, but that causes trouble because the pipes are designed for larger volume of water, but we use little water. So the pipes have to be flushed by the water companies with large amounts of water, which are then priced into the water price again. So actually, the water saving in Germany doesn't save money and doesn't save water. So do you have the debate here as well?
That sounds like a fantastic problem to have. Dare I say, is that a result of German over-engineering? I don't know. It sounds very good. Okay, I'll ask that one to our panelists in a moment. But let's actually, if we go like this, and if you could, if there's a lady there beside you who'd like to ask a question, then there's a lady on the end here, then there's a gentleman in the front. We'll go like that, yeah?
My question is to the entire panel, including Fiona, and it's about communication. And as Andy tweeted on his way here, the complex issue of communicating to a public on water scarcity who are also experiencing floods.
Yep, very good question. Yep, and one that I encounter every day, trying to write about droughts, floods, when we don't know which we're going to be having from one day to the next. There's a lady on the end here in red. Thank you.
Elaine Ashley. I don't know if there's an answer to this one. I just want to check I didn't misread one of Amy's slides. It suggests that government policy only required the water companies not to have an increase in leaks. So although you're reducing, I didn't see anything that suggested the government requires you to reduce leaks. Just wondering what people think this suggests about how seriously the government takes the problem.
Excellent. I will ask that. And then if we could have the microphone down here next. And that's the final one in this batch, and then we'll take some questions over here.
Martin Bigg, Chair of Bristol Green Capital. I'll give credit where credit's due. It's the result of some of the environmental initiatives from Bristol and Wessex Water that we were able to say in Brussels that that's why Bristol should be the European Green Capital. However, there are many cases where the solutions that water companies are coming up with are very high-tech and very expensive. Thames sewer as a classic example, desalination, and of course providing everyone with water in plastic bottles. Can we not drive for more reuse of green and grey water in the way we design and operate our buildings?
Excellent question. Thank you very much for that. Okay, panelists. Aimee, I think I'll start with you because there was one question very specifically for you, which was this question of government policy not to have more leaks rather than reducing. So if you could address that. And while you're at it, perhaps you could tell us about this issue of Germany. I don't know if you're familiar with the German water infrastructure, but if you are, perhaps any insights you've got on that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so just to clarify, yeah, that maybe my slide wasn't so correct. The government are certainly certainly requiring us to leakage must not rise, and they also want to see it reduce beyond the 3% that the industry as a whole is reducing it over the current 5-year period. We work in 5-year business planning cycles, and all the water companies are bringing it down by about 3% over that period as a national average, and they said they want to see that trend continue. So there's no specific, it must be reduced by this percentage by this date or any kind of hard guidance like that, but there's certainly, I don't think they'd be very welcoming of any of our plans that did show an increase, that's for sure. They would like to see that go further. And no, I'm not familiar with Germany's infrastructure, and it's not an issue. I can see that issue, but it's not something that I've been familiar with, or any of my colleagues raising it in our particular area. It would be interesting to see whether that is something, and it's something that we do need to obviously be aware of. Flushing is something that happens often for water quality issues in the network, that sediment will kind of form at the bottom of pipes that gets deposited if it's only small, low volumes moving through. So we have a flushing programme, but it's not a significant one, but it'd be interesting to see whether there is an increase in trend of flushing as we've seen demand reducing in time. It's not something I'll look into though, because it's an interesting thought.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Andy, I'm going to ask you next. And we had a question there about some of the solutions here, and I'm sure that there are solutions that your company has been looking at, among other things, around water. Some of them tend to be rather high-tech and expensive. But how do we drive reuse and other methods of water efficiency, do you think?
Well, let me give you an example from my own business. So in Dar es Salaam, city Tony talked about, we have put $10 million of capital equipment in the last 3 years to deal with poor water quality. Because although, as Tony says, the Ruvu River does provide about 30% of the water that we use for the brewery there, about 70% comes from groundwater because it's a seasonal river or sometimes has low flows. And that groundwater is becoming brackish because Dar's on the coast and you're getting saline intrusion as the aquifer falls. Now, our boreholes are licensed, but hundreds are not. And so what we've had to do there is put in reverse osmosis equipment and replace pipes and all sorts of stuff because of the salinity of the water. So, but what that tells us is that putting in $10 million to deal with an incoming water problem in a way that ultimately won't solve that problem isn't the best way to allocate funding over the long term. And so that's why we're working with GIZ, with various government agencies in Tanzania, with WWF and others, to try and have a bigger conversation around how we resolve the multitude of issues that make up Dar's water supply problem. And so the answer is yes. We need more innovative solutions. We've got some examples in different parts of the world. In South Africa, in Port Elizabeth, we treat some of the wastewater from our brewery with reed beds. It takes a lot of land, but is quite efficient, and it's working quite well. But the final thing, if I can just say something about the kind of unintended consequences bit, which I think is where that German pipe flushing example comes from, is that they're all over the water sector. So, for example, we've got a number of occasions around the world where we have dramatically reduced from good levels, but to even better levels, the organic load in our wastewater that's going out to municipal treatment plants from our breweries. And what's happened within a couple of years, it saved us money, obviously, in the short term. What's happened in a couple of years is that the municipality's changed its pricing structure because it still needs the income. And so for us, the business case disappears. And so the business trying to do the right thing ended up with no business benefit at all, and not really giving a good message to other businesses around the place that this is something we should incentivize. So we always need to think at the system level.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that. And Tony, finally, I'll come to you. Perhaps you'd like to take on the communication question of, how do we communicate these vast differences in what we see in the different sorts of problems that we have associated with too much, too little water?
Yeah. Well, its flood turns it into really quite a hard thing to sell to the public in terms of you should be saving water. And so what do you do about that? Well, one form of communication, of course, which has been mentioned already by Aimee, is giving people some sense of the cost they've got. And so metering gives you some very valuable information, which is a form of communications about how much you're using through the prism of price. And I think, that has worked in different parts of the world, and it seems to be one of the ways in which we might proceed. I do think there are social questions linked to that, of course, in terms of people on very low incomes, and I do think one of the things you said, Fiona, might be worth looking at in terms of these so-called block rising tariffs, where your subsistence use is pretty much free, but if you start to wash your car or fill a swimming pool, then your kind of per capita use is going up, and that maybe should be reflected in different bands of use. So luxury use is per litre more expensive than subsistence use. But I think, if you can do some of that to correct some of the social challenges, I think that the metering could be a very effective way of communicating. One thing I have picked up, though, from one or two friends in the water industry is actually how talking about water use reduction during a drought does actually work. And I don't know, Aimee, if you've spotted this in your company, but I know in the Thames region, there has been a discernible reduction by going on the radio, putting posters on the underground, on the side of buses. People do respond to that. And I think that's something which is quite encouraging in the extent to which people pick this up. And it's also perhaps, it's also maybe, we've all become climate change obsessed in recent years. Maybe there's a communications piece about water use which has got less to do with how much water there is in the environment any one month compared to the next month, but is more to do with the amount of energy used to supply it under any conditions. And I know that where I live in East Anglia, I think I'm right in saying that out of the two big energy users in the East Anglian region, one is the health service and one is the water companies. And this is energy being used to pump water around, to clean it and to pump it back again. And so it doesn't matter how much it's raining or how much of a drought there is, that's a big carbon footprint. And maybe if we talked about some of those issues as well, we might be able to get people to engage more with the water issue, despite the confusing headlines around droughts and floods.
Yeah, just the show before towards one of my penultimate slides was showing that really demand for water at the moment is really at an all-time low in the area, and I think that our customers have been quite responsive to the messages. Even though in the Wessex area we've not had a hosepipe ban in place, then I think that people have been really responsive and taken on board the messages that everybody's been putting out.
Thank you very much. And as that question was directed to me as well, I'll just give a very brief answer as well. And from my point of view as a journalist, writing about, well, for a start, as soon as you write about drought, it starts to rain.
Guaranteed, isn't it? It's like a rain dance.
That's actually a very, very powerful tool in the water company's repertoire. But also, of course, when we do get situations where we go very quickly from drought to flood, I think the key there is to sort of treat the readers or the listeners or the viewers as grown-ups. Because, once you've got over this kind of, isn't it incredible, we've got hosepipe bans, but we've got flooding at the same time, which is kind of, amusing for a few milliseconds. Once you've got over that, then people want to know, well, why is this happening? And there are lots of important reasons why this is happening. When you get a drought, you get dry compacted soils, and then you get sudden rainfall that kind of runs off and so on and causes flash flooding. People want to know these actual sort of scientific, sort of physical reasons behind these phenomena, and they want to know how it might affect them and how it can be solved. And people have a genuine interest in these questions and the answers to these questions. And I think that it's the role of communicators, whoever they are, to try and answer those questions for people and to do it in a serious way. This side of the room has had all the questions so far. I'm going to take questions from here now, and I'm going to take several in a clump because we've not got long left. Gentleman here, I saw you first, and then we'll go here, and we'll come to you after. Yes, please.
Bring a bit of levity to it. As a Somerset farm boy, I was grown up on cider because basically I was doing my bit for the environment. If the more cider I drunk, it supported the Somerset orchards. I'm now in a bit of a quandary that I think, well, should I actually be drinking cider? Would I be better drinking lager because maybe it uses less water, or real ale? And obviously I'd only look to go to a bar that had waterless urinals.
Good.
Excellent. Stand up for cider. Thank you very much for that. We've got a question here.
Hi, it's Matt Wood. It's to Aimee, really. Just how does demand reduction fit with a business model which is based on consumption per unit?
Yeah. Yep. Thank you very much. We've got a gentleman also in the front here. And then remind me who was over there. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
There is so much more that one can do other than metering. My wife and I, who frequent visitors, have actually got lower water charges than my 86-year-old mother-in-law. And the reason for that is that I harvest all my roof water. I only use the metered water to top up. All the hard surfaces that are around the house drain into flower beds, so I don't have surface drainage charges. And the water is heated by solar. Now, why are housing associations, some are, for example, has to, but not many housing associations are incorporating water harvesting as a routine. And there are so many ways that the building industry could get their act together and cut domestic water use considerably. okay, industry is the bigger factor, but if other industries apart from the brewing industry are also working on cutting their water usage, then both domestic and industrial usage could come down very rapidly.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. We will try and get you an answer as to why social housing isn't doing that. Yes, please, your question.
Okay, Kevin Pebbody from the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. Given the demand or the threat in the future that water supply is going to be limited, shouldn't our water companies be investing heavily in natural wetlands to store the water for them in the future?
Great question. Thank you very much. And then I think we had a question here at the back from this gentleman here.
My question was about water harvesting, but also compostable toilets as well on a local level. So.
Okay. Excellent. Let's see what our panel thinks of those. Have we any more very, very final questions? Do we have? Oh, sorry, I missed you out, sir. I was going to take this one here at the front, and that's it, I'm afraid, because we're going to run out of time.
Global strategic question for Tony, that the CIA was talking and worrying as far as back as the 80s or 70s about water resources and water wars. But there is evidence, in fact, that conflict, troubles over water can unite people and draw them together. And Tony probably knows of the Friends of the Earth Middle East who've been doing fantastic work in Israel-Palestine in drawing communities together. Indeed. And I wonder if in your circles there is a discussion of a big input of water harvesting in Israel-Palestine, trying to draw people together to work on a common problem that might divert them away from conflict.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that, sir. Okay, I'm going to take Aimee first, because we had a few questions there that are specifically for the water industry. One, how are you going to do demand reduction? How do you have an interest in demand reduction when your business model is about selling more water? Then why aren't social housing automatically being fitted with things like water harvesting technology? And then I'll give you this, your choice. We had two others as well that I think are relevant to you. One was investing in wetlands. That we can ask other panelists that if you'd like, and then the composting toilets. How many composting toilets are there in your water area? I'd like to know. Thanks.
Okay, we'll start with the demand reduction one. It's a good question. Lots of people are always very, very sceptical of water companies that are trying to promote demand reduction. Obviously, we do get an income from selling the water. First and foremost, we have a statutory obligation to actually promote water efficiency. So we have to do that. We have to provide a baseline kind of advice service to our customers to do that. More recently, Ofwat are primarily our financial regulator, but they started to tell us that we had a target to meet. So we have certain water efficiency targets, litres saved per year, which are related to the number of houses that we have. So all water companies have now got that as a specific target as well. So we've got those kind of obligations to meet. But also, thankfully, I don't work for our finance director, and so I don't necessarily have to worry about the money side of things too much. But I understand that our marginal costs will obviously come down if we're having to abstract less water to put out. Then we won't have so much cost associated with that. But also, we're looking really to expand our service provision. So if we are looking to fill that income gap that may come as a result of reducing demand, then we might try and sell you other services. So we could try and sell to businesses advice on water efficiency. We could try and sell other kind of services to fill that gap. So it does still come back in and fit our kind of business model. Hopefully that will answer your question. And the building regulation question about rainwater harvesting, we've got the Code for Sustainable Homes in this country, which means that there are different levels, and new houses and new buildings have to be built to certain standards. All new houses now have to be designed with 125 litres per person per day in mind. Of course, it all comes down to behaviour and what those people do when they move in and how many people live there, because obviously it's more efficient to use water if you live in large households rather than just one person there, because your water use is shared amongst more people for those kind of combined activities like washing and cooking. There was a recent study done in Kent where they looked at new build housing association properties, and they were allegedly designed to only use 105 litres of water, but the study results are showing that actually that's close to 117 litres. So there is obviously a bit of a mismatch there that we need to be bearing in mind going forward in our planning, that maybe even if we design these things in mind, if we don't support it with education and trying to improve behaviours around water efficiency, then we may not still be able to deliver those savings even with those regulations in place. Anyone else like to talk about the other issue? Oh, there was the wetlands. I don't know anything about composting toilets, I have to admit. I'm not sure if... I've got a few Wessex Water colleagues here. Would anyone else like to step in and talk about composting? Oh, you've got one. Maybe you could...
I have a self-contained indoor composting toilet, and it works very, very well indeed. It has a 24/7 extract fan to the outside, so it doesn't smell. It's extraordinary. It's incredibly simple to use and maintain, and produces extremely good, high-quality compost.
That is... Sorry.
The 80 milliamps.
That is fantastic. I'm so glad to hear from you. That's very good. There you go. Composting toilets, a vote for them. Andy, I'm going to give you your final word and chance to answer those questions as well. I don't know if you've got a composting toilet. You've certainly got a fan over here talking about cider and its excellent water efficiency. And I'll just give you your final words.
Well, thank you, and let me use the gentleman who recycles his cider so efficiently as a kind of jumping off point, because the point I wanted to make in the question that no one has graciously asked is well, should we stop consuming, or should we not consume so much, including beer? And I think there are 2 points to make there. One is that there is still so much waste in the systems overall that we have. I mean, take agriculture. Agriculture uses 70% of water, and yet in the developing world, around 30% of harvests just rot in the field, and the developed world, up to 30% of the food that ultimately ends up packed in our fridges gets chucked in the bin afterwards. And so actually, there's a huge amount of wastage in that whole system, which if we address it, can tackle climate change, fossil fuel issues, water issues, a whole range of different things together. It's that nexus, but writ small in your fridge. So actually thinking through, as I'm sure you do, but more broadly, thinking through how we consume to still get the same quality and enjoyment from our products, but do it in a dramatically more efficient way is something consumers, businesses, government, and others need to work together on quite rapidly, I think. And that's where I think the whole piece around social media is quite important, because particularly in water, the numbers are quite complex, because water is not like carbon. With carbon, a ton of CO2 emitted in Bangalore is the same as a ton of CO2 emitted in Bangkok, but actually it's very different in water. You know, you can use a lot of water to make a beer in Norway, and it's no problem at all. So the issue is, how do we somehow engage people with some of the complexity of their very local issues, but in a way that's accessible? And I think that's where social media, rather than perhaps a product label on a beer bottle, but actually a much more engaging way of getting people into the data and the life cycle of their products and the value chain and the decisions they can make, is a way forward. And one thing I'd like to give an ad for is a campaign called thirstforwater.org. It's based out of China. It's motivating millions and tens of millions of Chinese school children and consumers around how they think about water, and that's in a country where the immediate water challenges to economic growth are very, very real.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And finally, Tony, I'd like to ask you the question about wetlands. Should we be investing in wetlands? Should water companies in particular be investing in wetlands, and perhaps other companies? And also we had this final question here about water wars and how conflict can be avoided through people working together on water.
So in relation to the wetlands, first of all, my remarks earlier, I was kind of making the point about how we can get a great deal of value out of working with natural systems and using them in a more deliberate way to iron out some of the volatility in the water cycle, whether that's in relation to flood prevention or in relation to water storage. And I think there's a vast opportunity there, and one or two of the examples I mentioned earlier, I think beginning to see in different parts of the world how this can be done. It's really a question of how you set this up, though, and create the incentives and the mechanisms to make it work. And you know, the way that this is going in some places is through the route of payment for ecosystem services. So finding a way of creating an economic value which can be paid for by somebody. And so the water consumers in New York City are paying for the preservation of the Catskill Hills, and actually that turns out to be cheaper than buying a new water treatment plant. So finding ways of doing that. But as Andy said earlier on, you know, there's examples, but they take a while to do because you've got quite a lot of actors there. It's very easy to build, well, it's not actually that easy, but it's relatively easy to build a big reservoir where there's one decision by a government and a lot of concrete. It's more complicated to get several thousand farmers to cooperate in looking after one area of catchment. But it can be done. There's examples there. So I think we should invest more in that. And I think in the end, it's going to be cheaper for consumers. So there's a good story there in all ways. And as I say, you get multiple benefits from it. It's not just the water cycle that you're helping to make more secure. You're getting carbon benefits, biodiversity, and recreational ones as well, and health benefits for people. So there's a lot to be said there. And actually, that was my remark, my thought about the remark on cider. You know, in terms of, you know, which is the most water-intense beverage, I think stick with the cider, not only because it's a nice drink, but also because it's got great biodiversity value in terms of the apple orchards. It's got a huge landscape importance, and it's a traditional industry that we'd like to protect for all sorts of other reasons. And I think, you know, that message for me, in every environmental issue I've ever looked at, you know, you always are struck by the importance of taking the broad view. And it's more complicated, obviously, but I think if you do that, then you get to much better solutions. And I'm going to have a tin of cider on the way home, or a draft cider, if I can possibly find one. And so just in terms of the point about water wars and what the CIA was saying some years ago, I think, you know, they were right to point to this as like yet another source of tension in the world. But I think your remark about the extent to which, you know, people can cooperate to solve these problems is really, really important. And I think one of the things we need to be building alongside, you know, engineering and solutions with nature is social infrastructure that can anticipate some of these issues. And I think it's very much to do with the circumstances of the place. Probably the worst example I saw of real tension that could have led to something nasty was disputes over the River Tigris on the border between Turkey, Syria and Iraq. Could you imagine a more tense place in the world with dams being built in three borders in three countries simultaneously, and big arguments about who owned the flow of the river, you know, almost impossible. Whereas, as you mentioned, you know, if you invest the time to bring people together, and Friends of the Earth Middle East have done some outstanding work on this, and I was with them last summer in the West Bank and saw what they were doing there in the creation of a so-called peace park, which is basically, it's a political process to bring Jordanian, Palestinian and Israeli communities together with the job of restoring the River Jordan as part of what they want to do for reasons of biodiversity and nature and everything else. And it is helping to reduce social tensions as well as to deal with the problem of the water supply there. But that's a tricky, delicate task, and it's one of those soft, fluffy issues that, you know, we tend not to talk about when we have these conversations, but I think probably lessons there, as there are lessons around how you might gear an economic relationship between water users and nature, probably there's some good lessons to be learnt about how you can use water tensions actually not only to avoid problems, but actually to build a sense of community.